Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 149 of the Ad Nauseam podcast. My name is Dr. Jeff Winkle. I am down here once again in the bunker with my good friend and excellent co-host, Dr. David Noe. How you feeling, Dave?
I'm doing pretty well, Jeff. This is much earlier in the day, time-wise, than those times previously when we have been down here in the bunker podcasting.
Yeah.
What does the clock say? What's the sundial?
I think that they were just a little bit after 9 a.m.
9 a.m.?
Yeah.
Don't we have real jobs?
No, I don't know. We got nothing better to do.
So we're down here podcasting on a balmy, what is it? Is it a Tuesday morning?
Balmy Tuesday morning.
Okay.
Yeah. But how do you like to burn the morning oil?
No. Whatever the opposite of burning the oil is, that's what I do in the morning.
Gotcha. Right.
So, I'm getting to that age where sleep is a little more elusive.
Yes.
So I go to sleep late at night because I'm burning lots of midnight oil.
Yes.
I'm lucubrating. And then I have these plans. So I'll get up at X time and I set it. It doesn't matter. I wake up the same time every morning.
Right.
So someone who was wise, right, would go to bed earlier knowing that this is going to happen.
Yeah.
It's the old gag about nighttime Jerry has no consideration for morning Jerry.
That's right.
It's a different guy. He'll pay the piper.
Yes, exactly.
But it doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work, and it's a very difficult lesson to learn.
Mm-hmm.
No, I do that. I'm more of a morning guy, I think, than you are. But even that same thing is if I get hooked into a show,
right?
And so I'll just watch one more episode. Yeah. You look up, and now it's 1:30 in the morning.
Right.
Well, I'll sleep in. No, then boom, you wake up same time.
Exactly. I'll have one more sleeve of Fig Newtons.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Brian Regan.
Yes.
So I was thinking, recently.
Yeah.
Thinking back to some memories of when I was a young unmarried man.
Yeah.
And I was seeking to impress the ladies.
Yes.
Right. So I had a clean shirt, new shoes, and I didn't know where I was going to. I had a silk suit, a black tie.
Yeah.
And I didn't know a reason why. Why?
Right. Yeah.
But I was looking good. I was ready for everything. But then as I was walking through this one public area, there was like a fountain there.
Yeah.
Right. And I fell into the fountain, and it was filled with goldfish.
Yes. And
these goldfish, they covered my clean shirt, my new shoes, silk suit, and black tie, and everything.
Yeah.
And I was really worried that this was going to mess up, my efforts to impress the ladies.
Yeah. So this sounds terrible.
It does.
Yeah.
But then I realized that they come running just as fast as they can.
Yeah.
Because every girl's crazy about a carp-dressed man.
Oh man! Well done. I was thinking I couldn't see where it was going.
Couldn't see it, could you?
But man, yeah, carp dress man. Yeah, that's true. That's a can't miss dating strategy.
Yeah, exactly. So the question is, have we reached a new low of stupid?
That's quite. I don't know. I think there's still
some room on the bottom.
We hit the bottom of the barrel, but we're tunneling through.
Yes. Well, I think next week it's your turn. So,
oh man, that's
the gauntlet has been thrown down.
That's right.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah, because it's become. I mean, I think our regular listeners will recognize it's not about just being stupid. It is about being stupid.
It is about being stupid.
But it's also about trying to keep the other person from guessing.
That's correct.
Where you're going.
And where's the consistency in the stupid? Where's the flair?
Right.
I mean, anybody can be stupid, but you have to do it with, style.
Yes.
That's
fine line.
That's what we're after. So what are we talking about today, Jeff?
We are continuing our look through Henri Marrou's history of education in Antiquity. And I believe we're getting into the second main section.
That's correct.
Of the book today.
Yes, part 2. So we're going to wrap up the tiny little remaining portion of Isocrates, an episode that dropped, as they say, today.
Yep.
And then we're going to move on to part 2, chapter 1, the civilization of the Paideia. Mm-hmm. And a really interesting theme of that chapter, just to kind of preview it for the audience, is that civilization or culture becomes religion.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That'll be something worth examining.
Right. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting about how he. I mean, we're getting ahead of things, but Marrou talks about how it's really after or kind of during the era of Aristotle and Alexander the Great that education really becomes cemented.
Correct.
And he makes the argument that it doesn't really change for the rest of antiquity.
And into the modern era, too.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're dealing with today.
Yeah.
So then, as we finish up the last little bit of Isocrates, we need to begin at page 90 of Marrou. And just to remind the reader, H.I. Henri-Irénée Marrou wrote this work, A History of Education in Antiquity. He was a Frenchman, self-proclaimed Christian humanist, and this is his magnum opus. So a lot of persons had written on education in antiquity. I think this is kind of a watershed book because it attempts to synthesize and bring into one place all of this very diverse and scattered information.
Yeah. Excellent.
So, page 90, this will serve as our opening quote. The spirit of finesse, in quotation marks, and the geometric spirit. So that is the subject heading. And Marrou writes, fundamentally, the difference between Isocrates and Plato was the difference between Pascal's two kinds of mind, the sensitive mind, the spirit of finesse, and the geometrical. The things that Isocrates tried to foster in his disciples were ability to make decisions, an intuitive grasp of the complexity of human affairs, and a perception of all of the imponderable factors which help to direct one's opinion and make it a just one. Literature, the art, not the science of speech, is the best instrument for sharpening the faculty of judgment. The instrument is not in itself sufficient, meaning literature. A certain gift is needed too, for in this field of reality, moral human reality, there can be no infallible system ensuring that any mind will get the right result simply because it is rational. There was nothing more absurd, in Isocrates' view, than the Socratics' attempt to turn virtue into a kind of knowledge, a science, like mathematics, that could be taught.
So how does this relate to what we were talking about Isocrates last time? I mean, we talked a lot about how he diverges from Plato on a number of instances. Are we to take it that Marrou is, in this part of the chapter, he's arguing that this is where this is the main kind of watershed moment where he breaks away for good.
This is the quintessential difference between the two individuals, between Isocrates and Plato. Mm-hmm. So for Plato, dialectic, rhetoric, the elenchus, the method of question and answer refutation, is all in the service of finding what is true.
Right.
Distinguishing between techne, which is the craft or the art of doing something, and true knowledge, episteme. And if I'm understanding Marrou correctly, Isocrates kind of just waves his hand at that and says, no, this entire attempt is misguided.
Yeah.
You can't turn virtue into a kind of knowledge. It's not a science like mathematics, and so it can't be taught in that way. What you need to do is to set the system with literature. It's an art, not a science, and literature will then help shape people's faculty of judgment and will turn them into the right kinds of persons, moral persons, not immoral sophists,
right,
but moral persons for the service of the polis.
Yes, right, exactly. So it's more you wouldn't read Homer for like a checklist on how to achieve virtue, but more you are absorbing these things to become, and as you absorb them, they become part of your character.
Yes.
Okay.
Now maybe it's the fact that I have been influenced by Plato positively, and I really love Plato's thought, and I'm so attracted to it, that I have discerned personality types when it comes to discussion of character formation.
Yeah.
And I think that the Isocrateses, they outweigh the Platos something like 5-1.
Really? Okay.
So I've had conversations with people about the question of education in particular. And because, I know the classics, at least to some extent, folks are sometimes surprised that I don't believe there's an easy 1-to-1 kind of ratio between study the classics, become a better person.
Yeah.
Read classical literature. Now your character is automatically going to be shaped. Now, in fairness to those persons, they probably would never say it's automatic.
Yeah.
They would say, oh, no, it's not automatic. There are other things that need to be involved, especially if they're Christians. They'll acknowledge the need for the Holy Spirit. But if you ask them, so how precisely does this happen? What is the mechanism whereby my reading Plato instead of James Joyce, my reading something that's truly maybe they would count Joyce as a classic. So let's say my reading Aristotle rather than reading Mad Magazine.
Yeah.
How is that going to shape my character? How precisely? And usually, I have found that they usually don't have a very clear or persuasive answer.
Yeah.
So they may not like the real Platonic idea, which is find out what the truth is and stick to that.
Yes.
They find that a little bit wooden, you might say, and apparently the same way that Isocrates did. But they've yet to propose, to my mind, a persuasive alternative.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. I mean, my sense of, I think one of the reasons that classics programs or in academia or in schools, I think one of the reasons that it continues to hang on in some sense is kind of this assumption that because they have this kind of place in history, they are therefore good. But I think that one of the reasons that they're shriveling is that because I think a lot of those places also aren't asking the very question you just said. It's just kind of the assumption that because it's old, because it's ancient, because it's foundational, therefore it must be good and must produce goodness.
Right.
Rather than kind of asking the question, but how?
Yes.
Right.
So I think there's a thin veneer of respectability.
Yes, exactly.
For a lot of these individuals. And I don't know how deep is the commitment to the actual ideas, and that, frankly, that bothers me a lot.
Yes.
And so I've had people say, I teach the classics because they've said this to me, because I want to shape the character of the young people under my care. And so if I ask them, okay, but how does that happen? Can virtue really be taught? And there's kind of just an assumption that it can be. And so here that you can borrow from Isocrates or from Plato. Both of them were really skeptical about the actual teaching of virtue.
Yeah.
Isocrates apparently did not believe in it in any strict sense. Plato believed that perhaps it was possible, but he remained deeply skeptical that it could succeed.
Right, exactly. When I've encountered or I've had conversations along these lines with people, I myself often try to frame it in terms of like a Socratean ideal of self-examination.
Yes.
Right. And so, studying Plato isn't going to kind of turn you into a good person.
No.
But if studying Plato, Homer, Sophocles, whatever, can lead you to self-examination, okay, well, that might put you on the path towards something like that.
That's right.
Right.
So the dictum over the temple of Apollo at Delphi, gnothes auton, know yourself.
Yes.
Right. This was Socrates' marching orders, right?
Yeah.
And, the other kind of slogans, the unexamined life is not worth living. But I would say, and this may be a little bit controversial, I would say specifically from a theistic or a Christian standpoint, that really isn't adequate. So let's say I examine my life and I decide I really like being a vicious person. Right?
Right.
I like stealing Jeff's shoes. And
by the way, I'm really sick of that, by the way.
Well, we're going to move up next to your ratio 8.
Okay.
Yeah. I can examine my life and I can know myself, but what if knowing myself leads me to a kind of Kierkegaardian despair?
Right.
I know I'm a really wicked person, and what? So what's next?
Yeah.
So it's not that it can't be useful, like you say,
but it has to be anchored in something else.
Exactly.
Yes.
It has to be headed somewhere, and I just don't find a clear resolution to those ideas. So I thought you articulated it well when you said sometimes the classics are kind of living on fumes.
Yes.
So these things are old, and we know they're valuable because they're old, and I'm willing to accept that premise, the idea that time has sifted out the garbage, you might say.
Yeah.
But how precisely does reading these works, how precisely is it supposed to affect us?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff in these authors that's not worthy of imitation. It's not admirable.
Right. Yeah. Without. I think also, on the more extreme side of things too, I have often found that there's also this idea that because you're like asking a class to read something,
right,
or you're teaching something. I'm talking about this. My wife ran into a kind of an issue in something that she was teaching in her class, and some parents objected. And without going into the details, the assumption was because you're teaching X,
right,
you are therefore advocating for X, right, and not using it as a way to,
of course,
to develop critical thinking or to self-examination, right? And so I think often there's that kind of easy equation of that because you're reading this, therefore you must be in favor of this.
Right. The difference between prescription and description.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Oftentimes things are said in a descriptive manner. This is how things are, and not in a prescriptive manner. These
Right.
are how things ought to be.
Right.
If you read the book of Proverbs, right, in the Old Testament, the wisdom literature, it says things like, I'm paraphrasing, a bribe can get you a long way with a rich man, right? You read that next to the proverb that says something like, fools despise wisdom and understanding. The one is, they're both descriptive in some sense, but the one about a bribe will get you a long way with a rich man is not at all intended to be advocating that kind of behavior.
Right, right.
It's describing what the world is actually like. So then how are you going to respond?
Yes.
In that light.
Yes.
In that light. So Marrou goes on the same page, and I think it's worthwhile to dwell here just a little bit longer. He says, here it is necessary to go a little more deeply into the question of the connection which we have said exists between rhetoric and morals, and to discuss in much greater detail the intimate bond that we believe the art of oratory creates between form and content. These, we said, are inseparable. And this is so because the effort to find the right expression demands and develops a sensitivity of thought, a sense of different shades of meaning, which it is difficult to express in conceptual ideas, and even sometimes impossible. This idea will be familiar to anybody who has read Valéry or Bremond. There are things that a poet feels and makes you feel at once, and which no amount of science can ever fathom. The result is that an oratorical kind of education, which in appearance is entirely a matter of aesthetics, whose one aim is to create, quote, wizards with words, is in fact the most effective way of developing subtlety of thought. So that's the Isocratean view.
Yes. Yeah.
What do you make of that, Jeff?
Well, as you were talking, it makes me think of, in some ways, I think maybe the corollary is very apt. Is oratory as it would connect to music,
Right.
And the intangibles of music. That music can make you feel a certain way. It can provoke a particular emotion.
Right.
It can change your day.
Right.
And you can't really, at least I can't scientifically break that down.
How that happens. I have an example.
Yeah.
We had some family over recently, and my nephew, who's a very accomplished musician, he likes our piano. It's not a fancy piano, but it's usually in pretty good tune, and it makes a nice solid tone. And so he's playing it in the other room, and he's playing some jazz, and he's very good, and I'm enjoying it, right? And after 3 to 5 minutes of this, he gets to the end of the song. And I'm sitting, far away in the other room and listening with half an ear.
Yeah.
But I can hear it. And it gets to the end of the song, and there's no resolution, to the chord progression, or I don't even know how to explain it. You can probably explain it. But my whole being just was screaming, resolve.
Yes.
Resolve. I can't. You can't end that way. I'm left so dissatisfied with that.
Right.
So then he gets up from the. If I'm remembering correctly, he may be listening. He gets up from the piano bench and comes in, and I say, that was great, but can't you resolve? And he said something to the effect that, sometimes life remains unresolved.
That's really good. Yeah, exactly. Now, that reminds me too is, the relationship between like mathematics and music, right? And so I would be the first person to say that music is not math, right? It's filled with these intangibles that move you. However, there's a lot of mathematics in music.
Absolutely. You can represent what's happening in mathematical terms.
Yes,
extensively.
And you can also show that particular chord progressions human beings generally like. And so when your ear is expecting a resolution. I think that's kind of mathematical. You want the equation to end, right?
Yes, I guess so.
And so there is kind of a mathematical aspect to music, but at the same time, it's endlessly variable, right? There's a notable comedy sketch where these guys, it's called the 4-Chord Song. And it's this musical comedy act. I think they're out of New Zealand or Australia, and they come on stage and they have their instruments, and the bit starts with one guy complaining, says, we've been a musical act for 10 years now. We've never had a hit song.
Right.
And the guy in the piano says, well, why? He says, we've never written a 4-chord song. And he kind of goes through the four basic chords and they end up doing
that undergird almost all pop music.
Exactly. And they end up doing this medley of about 50 songs.
Wow.
One to the next that all use that progression.
Right. So that's an argument in favor of classical music, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because of its greater complexity.
Definitely. that's then you pick up some turn on some Bach.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here, right? What exactly is the relationship between form and content? So those persons who say that ultimately form and content are indistinguishable, I can't accept that claim. I think there is an ability to distinguish between form and content. In other words, I don't believe that the form dictates the content. On the other hand, as Marrou goes on, he quotes from Isocrates, who says, quote, "The right word is a sure sign of good thinking." So this is an idea that I've held for a long time and even tried to defend in conversation with other people. Namely, that if you can't articulate your ideas well, if you can't speak them well, you probably don't understand them.
Yeah.
But, as I get older, I wonder, is that really accurate? Isocrates would say, for sure.
Right.
The connection between the mind and the tongue is absolute.
Yes.
It's unbreakable. You're talking to someone and you ask them a question. If they can't express their ideas well, then they don't really understand their ideas.
Yeah.
And they therefore don't hold them with the requisite firmness. Isocrates would defend this. Other people would say, no, it's technique, right? Some people are just better at talking. It's a technique, like shooting a basketball or playing the piano. They don't necessarily enjoy the music better because they can play it better. They just have that specific skill or technique, and speaking is like that.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I don't think it has one. I think it can be two things.
Are you going to say it doesn't have to be either
It
or?
doesn't. I think I'm more with Isocrates on this one though. And it kind of comes back to this. I think one of the things that I probably every culture, every society has lacked in, and I point the finger at myself too, is that failure to articulate, to failure to really think about, why do I believe this,
right? And
to be able to make an argument for it, rather than just kind of walking away with this easy assumption,
right?
And so I think that I like the Isocratean ideal, because I do think that call to articulation and precision is a worthy one.
Yes, but then what do you think about the result if a person is unable to do that? So not fails to try, but is unable to do so well. Does that indicate a lack of understanding? The right word, he says, this is a quote from Isocrates, the right word is a sure sign of good thinking.
Yeah. Well, I think you could certainly have an understanding of something without being able to articulate it. It's kind of coming down to nature versus nurture for me. I think there's some people are simply born with a greater skill to articulate, be it on a musical instrument or with your tongue.
Right.
That I think that, I would be willing to say that kind of skill is an indication of a greater level of understanding than someone who maybe grasps something but can't explain it.
I guess in part, that's well said. I guess in part this is why we have a natural and a negative reaction to someone like Gorgias, whose powers of expression are so exalted, but he leaves the impression that he doesn't really believe it.
Yeah.
Right? That it's just a game.
Yes.
I mean, like when one listens to and there aren't many of these, but a very accomplished political orator, right? Someone has written the speech, or maybe they've written it themselves, unlikely.
Yeah.
And they're reading it off something, and all the words and phrases are balanced and flowery, and there's metaphors and all of that. But you still just have this kind of suspicion that this isn't really true. This isn't real in some sense.
Right. Exactly.
I don't know.
Yeah. Then that's where technique, feel,
correct.
The music of it is going to lead you in one way or the other.
Right. It's a substitute for something more basic.
Yeah.
So wrapping up this chapter, then the next section, I like this metaphor a lot, is entitled "The Two Columns of the Temple," and this is Marrou 91. He says, quote, "Such are the two fundamental types of education, the two rival streams of development, which Plato and Isocrates set before Greek education, before what was to be the classical tradition." So as we get into the next chapter, we come into the Hellenistic era, and as you already said earlier in this episode, that's where the cement hardens, you might say.
Yeah.
So Marrou goes on, "For the purposes of exposition, I have been obliged, to a certain extent, to heighten the opposition between Plato and Isocrates. In actual fact, the two types of teaching were contemporary and ran parallel with each other. They did not always stand over against each other as rivals and adversaries. It would be extremely interesting, though in the present state of our knowledge it is in fact impossible, to describe the history of their interaction upon each other. This would probably prove very complex and involved, and it may have varied. They both had other opponents. There were other kinds of rhetoric besides Isocrates. He was opposed, for instance, to the pure sophistry of Alcidamas. There was other philosophy besides Plato's. The eristics, whom Isocrates combated, may have been chiefly Antisthenes and the thinkers of Megara. So we're getting into the weeds a little bit here.
Yeah.
But between the two party leaders, there may easily have been alliances in the face of a common enemy, a common front of dogmatics against the dissolvent criticism coming from the school at Megara, and indeed of ideologues, apostles of high culture, against the narrowness of political realists. So the idea, to summarize, if I'm understanding Marrou correctly, is that looked at from another perspective, Plato and Isocrates are much closer together, and they're both interested in maintaining the moral basis of aristocratic, educated men,
Yes.
and their involvement in the polis.
Yeah.
But they had quite different methods of getting there.
Right. I thought he did quite well in the earlier part of this chapter in noting how much Plato and Isocrates actually shared.
Right.
In some ways, it was more not playing with different decks of cards, but just shuffling them in a different kind of way.
Right.
Right.
Interesting. Shuffling them in a different kind of way. So then the last line here. By the door of the sanctuary, extending the metaphor, says Marrou, bottom of 91, by the door of the sanctuary which we are now about to enter, there arise on other side, like two pillars, the two sturdy Atlases, right? The figures of these two great teachers, Plato and Isocrates, quote, balancing and as though answering each other. Antis Rafus kai Suzugas, and that's a quote from Isocrates.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
in sum, right, Plato and Isocrates are representatives of two different aspects of the beginning of classical education.
Yeah.
Plato, rhetoric serves the objective of getting at the truth. So there's a little bit of artistry, but don't get distracted by the beautiful words. Go for episteme.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And you can find that especially in mathematics. And for Isocrates, the form of expression is itself an indication of the quality of your thinking.
Yes.
And trying to teach virtue as an objective science is totally misguided.
Yeah. Very well said. I love that visual picture of the two pillars, because I think that sets up the next section perfectly.
Yeah, Marrou did this very, very well.
Yeah.
I think it's an image that's going to stick in my mind.
Yeah, same here.
Hereafter. And Jeff, speaking of images sticking in our minds,
I'm guessing it's time for the ads.
that's right. This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the entrepreneur who decided he was not going to tolerate any more mass-produced coffee. Mr. Mark Helweg out there in Portland, Oregon, who put together a mean machine, the Ratio 8, and then he made the 6. Jeff, you are an owner of both of those, are you not?
Yes, I graduated from the 6 to the 8, but I had the 6 for probably a good year before I upgraded to the 8. Both excellent machines, and just yesterday,
Yes.
I met a friend for coffee.
All right.
Out at the local brew and beanery.
Was it that one on Fulton Street that we've made fun of before?
It was not. It was
Okay.
it was a different one. But my first sip, I realized I could have had something better at home.
You could have stayed home.
I could have stayed home.
Would this friend have come and met you at home, or is he a little bit frightened of the Ratio 8?
I think he's a little intimidated by
Yeah.
it. There's no need to be.
No.
But at all. But yeah, I mean, one sip and I'm always, why am I doing this? Why
Exactly.
why did I spend that money?
Go down to the bagel barn and beanery buckshot sort
Yeah.
of place and have some poor coffee.
No. So, I mean, it's so much nicer to have one of these wonderful machines. You've got the 8 on your,
I do.
your counter.
Yep, the oyster shell color with the walnut accents. I'm drinking from some coffee I brewed in it just moments ago, actually.
Excellent.
And I've been thinking a lot about something you said on one of the many previous episodes where
Yes.
we were shilling coffee, that you once tried some inferior quality coffee, a low grind, a low blend, and you were amazed. Something that your mom gave you, I think you said?
Yes, yeah, I remember this.
You were amazed at how the ratio turned average coffee into something really quite delicious.
It's very true.
Yes, and I've experienced that too recently.
Yeah, so there is kind of a mysterious alchemy.
That's right.
About it. But
nice.
I've got this great machine, and coming out soon. We're excited about this. Mr. Helwig is going to introduce the Ratio 4.
Yes, it is, quote, the first affordable and beautiful half-batch pour-over machine. The 4 is our smallest brewer yet, an agile, sleek machine. I wish someone would describe me that way.
Never got that on a student review.
Evaluation.
Yeah.
No, I never got it in a yearbook signing.
Oh, man.
That would have been so nice. It puts out between 5 and 20 ounces of coffee per batch, enough for 1 to 2 reasonably sized cups or 1 big travel mug. I think that, for me, that's really going to hit the sweet spot. Because although I love the 8, I'm pretty much the only coffee drinker in my family.
Oh, man. Okay.
And so I think this is really going to hit the sweet spot. And for our loyal listeners who want to promote the podcast and love drinking coffee, but they find the 6 and the 8 a little difficult to attain, maybe financially, I think that the 4 is really going to, it's really going to help them out.
Yeah, excellent. So, but in the meantime, hey, listeners, check it out. Ratiocoffee.com. Check out these machines. If you want to get on the 6 or the 8, or if you want to stick around and wait for the 4, go see what they have to offer.
That's right.
And if you're ready to buy, click on the machine you want. And Dave, what's our coupon code?
The coupon code for the month of May is ANCO. That's Ad Nauseam Coffee. ANCOF. And then the number 1. Jeff, what does the F stand for?
Well, F1, I'm thinking like it's like Formula 1 racing.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So,
yeah. I was thinking maybe frivolity.
Oh.
I don't know.
Yeah.
A cup of coffee it's going to lighten your day.
It is one of those simple pleasures
That's right.
that makes every day better.
So check it out.
Check it out. This episode is also brought to you by the good folks at Hackett Publishing. These guys have been with us from the very beginning of this podcast. They are a book publisher with offices in Indianapolis, Indiana, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. They've been around for 53 years, keeping the flame alive with all of their excellent publications in the arena of classics and in so many other areas of academia. I love these guys, and I love that they took a chance on this little podcast and are sticking with us.
Yes, that's really impressive. We're so grateful for the support that that Hackett has given to Ad Nauseam. And Jeff, I know you love the covers. You love Elvis Presley on Euripides' Bacchae.
Oh, so brilliant.
You like the covers of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the moon landing, and Normandy, the D-Day.
Yeah.
We've got Ovid's Metamorphoses in 2 brilliant translations, one by Stanley Lombardo, the other by Ambrose.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm kind of getting the impression, Jeff, that Hackett only has things from Greco-Roman antiquity. Is that right?
That is not true. That you can find things from all over the world: Islamic studies, Buddhist studies, philosophy, not just Greek philosophy, but philosophical studies from many different schools of thought. And as you just mentioned, translators, multiple translators of the same works. You can even pick and choose.
Yeah. So why might that be a good thing?
Well, I think that variety is key, and you as a language teacher and the language teaching I've done in the past, something we've talked about, translation of works it's not math, right? It's not just this one-to-one thing, and a good translation can do wonders, and a bad translation can really hold things back.
That's right.
And so I'm not saying that Hackett has bad translators, but that variety of translation, it's different readers are going to be pulled in.
That's right.
By different voices.
Very well said. So I'm looking at the Hackett page and I see Asian Studies, Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy, the 3rd edition. Right next to it is Philosophy, Duns Scotus, Treatise on the First Principle, translated, and commentary by Thomas Ward. And right next to it, Classical Studies, Ovid's Heroides, a translation of Ovid's Heroides, once again by our man Stan Lombardo.
Man. Yeah.
So it's a broad catalog. So the listener says to himself or herself, I want to expand my library, but I don't have a lot of dough lying around.
Yeah.
And I want to allow these guys to continue their mindless drivel.
Exactly.
So that every Tuesday, or, let's be honest, whatever day, it's anybody's guess, an episode drops, I get to listen to it.
Yeah.
What should such a person do?
Well, they should go to hackettpublishing.com. That's HACKETT publishing.com and take a look around. You're going to find something that you like. Drop it into the little basket there. And if you type in this coupon code, AN2024, That will get you to amazing things, 20% off your entire order, and free shipping.
Check it out. All right, Jeff. So as we get back into it today, we're going to move on in Marrou, and we're going to look at Part 2, Chapter 1, which is entitled...
The Civilization of the Paideia.
The Civilization of the Paideia. So we are on, what, page number...
This is 95.
Page number 95. You know what? I have heard that some people are actually following along with these episodes quite closely, this series.
Oh, excellent.
And I even heard recently that one of our colleagues, a classics professor at another institution, assigned a few of these episodes on Marrou to one of his students.
Oh, that's so cool to hear.
Yeah, so they're making good use of it.
Excellent.
So as Marrou begins here, I want to read just a portion of this first paragraph, and then we're going to get into this really interesting chapter. So he says, "At this point, we reach the very heart of our subject, and our study of the education of antiquity now becomes truly rewarding." So I'm thinking, it took you this many pages, Marrou? Come on.
Yeah, is he saying just the first 94 pages were just filler?
Yeah, he's phoned it in.
Yeah.
Anyway, to continue, for the aim of any historical inquiry is not so much the enumeration of stages of development as the analysis and synthetic understanding of its subject matter, as the latter is found in its mature form, with all its values fully developed. It was only in the generation following Aristotle and Alexander the Great that education assumed its classical and definitive form. Thereafter, it underwent no substantial change. It is true that there was some further development, but this was little more than the completion of a process that had been going on from the very beginning, the fulfillment of tendencies already present.
That's really interesting. Yeah, especially that statement that thereafter it underwent no substantial change.
Yes, that was really striking, isn't it?
Yeah, and as I'm holding Marrou's book in my hand,
right,
there's a good 300 pages to go.
That's right.
So if there's no substantial change, my first question is, okay, what is going to be the content of the rest of this book?
Right. Well, you really want some feedback on that?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think he's going to trace, as he'll say in not too far after this, he's going to trace this notion that was concretized, solidified during the Hellenistic era through various stages, right? Take it down into Rome and then into the three Renaissances, right? Which is, of course, the second sophistic, which I'd like you to talk about more in just a minute. Then the Carolingian Renaissance, 800 under Charlemagne, and then the Renaissance, right? The Italian Renaissance in the 14 and 15 and 1600s.
Yes. Yeah.
So
okay.
it's a playing out of this notion in various stages. But one thing that really struck me as I read this chapter is, if you had asked me, what is classical education? I would have given you my answer. But if you had said, when did it really reach its apex or get codified? I probably would have given the wrong response. I would have said something about late 5th century. I would have talked about Herodotus, the beginning of Socrates' career, because there was such a flowering then of all things under Pericles.
Right.
The tragedians, the comedians, and so forth, architecture. But that's not the right answer. It didn't really come into its own until the Hellenistic era.
Yes.
And Marrou makes that point brilliantly.
Yeah, and another thing that really struck me too, that I think I also would have given the wrong answer if I was asked, well, whose ideas are the foundation of what education becomes.
Right.
It's not I'm not dismissive of Plato.
Yeah.
But in terms of what's in the textbook.
That's right.
It's really Isocrates who wins that arm wrestling match.
That's correct.
Now, of course, Plato, of course, becomes foundational, as we get into the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, and as Platonic ideas merge with Christian ideas.
Yes.
And then Plato again takes another forefront. But if we're talking just about education, what's happening in the schools,
right.
It's Isocrates' kind of more practical approach which wins the day.
Absolutely. So I might have chosen a little different word than merge, but I know what you're after. And you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Platonic ideas become indispensable, to the execution of Christian theology.
Yeah.
You got to use that language and those thoughts to express very different ideas.
Exactly.
So when is the Hellenistic era? So much of this chapter is about classical education reaching its apex in the Hellenistic era, but how do we define that?
The usual dates of that are roughly the death of Alexander,
right,
until Augustus takes over.
Yes,
right.
So I think it's 323. I think is the death of Alexander.
Yeah,
and then
31.
Yes, that's right. Battle of Actium.
Yeah.
So there's that great book by Peter Green of Brackish Tang fame.
Exactly. Yes, our guy.
From Alexander to Actium.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And, such a monumental book, a watershed book. Therefore, setting the table, I would say, for at least the next couple hundred years as to what is the Hellenistic era.
Right.
Alexander to Actium. Very tidy, very neat way to understand. And of course, you can always criticize it, as historians like to revise and say, well, nobody knew they were living in the Hellenistic era. Right. But we understand that when we teach and talk about these things, it's not science.
Yes.
We have to have convenient ways to understand different movements. So there's some artificiality, but you have to go with it.
Exactly. You have to kind of put brackets on some things just to, in some ways, have a conversation about it.
Correct. Yeah. How are you going to talk about 300 years of diverse changes in culture and literature and so forth?
Right.
Got to give things names, and you understand they're not precise.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think it's really interesting that so Marrou gives us the statement that education kind of reaches a foundational level,
right? And
he goes on to talk about how out of this comes the idea that the learning of letters is the beginning of wisdom,
correct?
Right, and
yes.
it's literature becomes the foundational element in education in a way that for Plato was never really the key.
No. So before we get to that little part, I didn't want to skip over the subsiding of the physical aspect of education.
Yeah.
That's an important part. You want to read just a couple choice quotes from that second paragraph on the same page, please?
Sure. So Marrou writes, so while still retaining its essentially moral character, education became more and more dependent on books, and in consequence took a more scholastic turn. The school came to the forefront and developed its institutional character, gradually taking the place of the spontaneous or organized youth club, with its characteristic atmosphere of more or less amorous relations between older and younger members. The transition to a scribe education has finally been accomplished.
Right.
So no more gym class.
That's right. No more seeing the training of the body and the development of a physique as an essential part of the aristocratic norm at which to be aimed.
Right.
So is this kind of like Revenge of the Nerds? Is that really?
I guess so. I guess. I mean, I'm again, audience, forgive us if we're kind of repeating ourselves. But I thought that one of the really interesting things in the previous chapters is how music and learning how to dance was part of a kind of essential masculine education.
Correct.
Right. Things that I think that very few people would ascribe to today.
That's right.
But yeah, a Revenge of the Nerds in that, there's no need, knowing how to read and write and speak and interpret is way more important than being able to run the 50-yard dash.
Right. Or to ride a horse, to throw the javelin, to chuck the discus. That notion of being good at everything, I guess, reemerged later on among the Romans. And maybe the notion of the Renaissance man who is capable in all fields, including physical activity. Maybe that was an ideal more, how do they say, honored more in the breach than the observance?
Yes.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But clearly it was during the Hellenistic era that education as primarily a literary undertaking became so dominant.
Yeah. And yes, exactly. And would you say that these kinds of things are still dominant today?
Yes, I think there's a harder division now than there used to be between these kinds of ideas. We have the stereotype of the stupid athlete, right,
the dumb jock,
and we have the stereotype of Professor Frink, right?
Yes, right.
That is the overly brainy, nerdy kind of individual who's not coordinated and can't do anything useful in practical terms.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of, a couple months ago, watching March Madness. And
that's a basketball phenomenon?
The NCAA Division I men's basketball tournament. And a lot of the ads will often be for particular schools want to sell themselves.
Sure.
And when they will almost always frame it in terms of the scholar athlete.
Yeah.
And they're also saying that, the vast majority of our athletes don't go on to the NBA or the NFL or whatever.
Right.
But they are, they're trying to kind of balance that scholar athlete ideal. I don't think that's something our culture takes seriously.
I don't think they take it seriously either. I think you're right.
But it's interesting to kind of see that in light of this. That's really kind of an old Athenian ideal
Right.
that disappears fairly quickly.
Yes, in the Hellenistic era.
Yeah.
Maybe one place that it is taken seriously is at smaller schools and
Yeah. Yeah.
Division 2, Division 3.
Right.
It also depends very much on the sport, I would say. So I am not, in any way denigrating the abilities and intelligence of athletes in the big money sports.
Yeah.
But in the small money sports or the no money sports, at the outset from the get-go, there is no financial future in this.
Exactly.
There just isn't. It's not as entertaining, apparently, for people to watch volleyball as to watch football and basketball and things like that.
Yeah.
It's just not as entertaining for whatever reason. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so if you're in one of those sports, you're in it for a non-financial reason.
Right.
It's even rarer that you could turn it into a career.
Exactly. I'm also reminded of, I remember in under our undergrad days, lots of complaining about my peers about like the PE requirements. I think we had to do like 4
Yes.
PE class and
tried to make them academic.
Yes.
I remember that part bugged me.
It bugged me too. I remember taking and doing very poorly on a test on the dimensions of a tennis court.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't mind having to take the activity-based classes, right? So I think I had to take a volleyball.
Yeah.
I took a jogging and then one other. So if it was a class where I'm actually playing a sport,
Yes.
I enjoyed that. But the PE class, and it's changed names so many times, right?
Yeah.
Kinesiology, I think, is the current term
Right.
du jour.
Yes.
It was in those classes where they tried to make it into something academic.
Yes.
That was irritating.
Yes, I found that irritating too. Right. So yeah, when I was in introduction to tennis and sitting there taking this quiz on the dimensions of a tennis court, I was thinking, why can't we just be outside trying to learn to play tennis, right? And so it was like in that class, it was like,
Right.
well, we'll teach you how to play tennis, but it's got to be academic too.
Right.
There's got to be a paper and
There's going to be an essay.
Yeah,
There's
right.
going to be
Right.
an exam. Couldn't you learn the dimensions of the tennis court more easily if you were standing on it, right?
Exactly. But at the same time, it bothers me to some degree. It's not something I think about a lot, but it kind of bothers me about how the sound body part of education isn't something our culture takes seriously anymore. Right. It's a joke.
Yeah.
And I think that's really sad.
Yeah. And it's probably going to get worse as machine learning and things like that. Or it could possibly become better. It could go the other way.
I guess so.
As some of the routine and mundane things, the routine and mundane intellectual tasks that we have to engage in.
Yeah.
Maybe if we are freed from some of those,
right?
Maybe we will. You're not.
Well,
we will devote that extra time to physical development and excellence.
I would love to think that.
No,
I'm cynical enough.
It's going to be more Hulu.
Exactly, more Hulu, more YouTube.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh well.
Yeah.
So the next page, 96.
Yes.
Marrou says, it must be said at once that there was no strictly autonomous Roman education. There was no strictly autonomous Roman education any more than there was any autonomous Roman civilization. So once again, the poor Romans, and I fully agree with Marrou, but the poor Romans are once again told your civilization and education is entirely derivative.
Yes.
Entirely derivative.
Right. It makes me think of, one of the, I'm not sure how grounded this is, but one of the ideas behind Plutarch writing his lives is he wanted to balance Roman intellectuals with Greek kind of more action types, right?
Predecessors and counterparts.
As a way to kind of balance out this notion that the Greeks are the nerds,
right,
and the Romans are the dumb jocks,
the brutes, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely a stereotype that survives to this day. Did we talk about this thing that came out about how much do men think about the Roman
We've talked
Empire?
about it many times.
Have we talked about right?
Proving the point of the entire meme, right?
Right.
The meme was how often do men think about the Roman Empire?
Yeah.
It was not how often do male podcasters talk about the Roman Empire.
But I think out of that came is that when men think about the Roman Empire, they're not thinking about Seneca and Cicero.
Definitely
they're
not.
thinking about the gladiatorial games.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
They are not thinking about Seneca and Cicero.
Of course.
Philosophy, Lucretius,
right,
Catullus, and all the wonderful literature. Definitely not.
So that division extends even to kind of those
You're right.
stupid memes that
That's right.
pop up, right?
Yeah. Marrou says Italy, and through her, the whole of the Latinized West was absorbed into the sphere of Hellenistic civilization.
Yeah.
So I guess the point that he's making, and it's well worth repeating, is that classical education is Greek.
Yes.
And it was put into its final form with no substantial change thereafter in the Hellenistic era. That's an important point to dwell on for a moment.
So, yes, education was Greek, but we need to talk a little bit about these massive political and cultural changes that were came on the heels of Alexander's conquest.
Yes, the juggernaut that was Alexander the Great.
Right.
Born in 356, I'm pretty sure. Born in 356.
And dies 323?
Yes, it lived to be only 33 years old.
Right.
So that's a number that I passed a long time ago.
Yes, same here.
And I did not accomplish... well, I don't know if we can call them accomplishments, but in any event, go ahead.
Exactly. So I'm jumping over to page 97 under a heading, Education, the Heart of Hellenistic Civilization, where Marrou writes, attention is commonly drawn to the abrupt change of scale entailed by the conquest of Alexander in the area covered by Hellenism. Its eastern frontier suddenly retreated over 2,000 miles from the fringe bordering the Aegean on the one side to the Sirdaria and the Indus on the other. And the stakes of war were now vast empires, not just a few feet of olive groves in the insignificant plains of Lelantos or Crissa. I love that last line.
Yeah.
Fighting over a garden.
That's right.
Yeah.
Outside of Athens somewhere.
Yeah.
So the retreat of the eastern frontier, almost 2,000 miles.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. Right. Especially when we think about all the stuff we've been talking about with classical education is in a fairly tightly circumscribed area.
Correct.
In the Attic Peninsula.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, not much, maybe not even the size of the state of Michigan.
Right.
It's very small.
And suddenly.
Right. It goes 2,000 miles, which I did a little bit of research. The distance from Grand Rapids, where we are located right now, to Los Angeles, California, is 2,100 miles, 2,175, right? If you were to drive it. Maybe a little less as the crow flies. You ever done any crow flying?
I've done very little crow flying.
Right.
But lots of road tripping. I've made that drive.
You've driven from here to L.A.?
Or from here to Las Vegas. And a little bit beyond. It takes a long time.
Can you imagine marching that distance?
No.
As a Macedonian soldier in a phalanx?
No.
Carrying your bread on your back?
Right.
That's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. Part of me, it doesn't surprise me that Alexander never made it back to Greece.
Through the vast trackless wastes?
Yes. Yeah.
And that his soldiers mutinied at one point and said, look, this is ridiculous.
Yeah,
we can't go any farther.
Right. Yeah. But Alex, by tradition, wanted to keep on going.
He wanted to go to China. He wanted to find the eastern trade routes.
Man.
So this had an impact. It's one of those interesting things in history. It had a vast impact on education, of all things, and on the subsequent history of the world by bringing the Greek language east.
Yes, exactly. And so out of this comes the Koine dialect of Greek, which, as I'm sure many of our listeners know, is the dialect of the New Testament.
That's correct.
Gospels and letters are written in, and it becomes kind of the common language.
That's right.
That binds all of these widely disparate cultures together to some degree.
For sure. Some of that Greek influence quickly retreated after Alexander and his cohorts left the scene. It wasn't an organized bureaucratic empire like the Roman one.
Right.
It was just outposts of Macedonian strongholds. But it stayed on pretty strong among the Seleucids and the Ptolemies in Palestine and other places, Egypt. Yeah. So in terms of the educational impact, though, what does Marrou say? So Marrou continues, same page, and he says, against this immensely enlarged background, that would be the Alexandrian expansion, the traditional framework of the ancient city broke up, or at least retreated into the background. It is true that the Greek type of city continued to exist. In fact, there were more of these cities than ever. Everywhere, except in Egypt, Alexander's successors carried out a Hellenizing policy by establishing or developing urban centers on the Greek model. Now, the Greek model, and we need to do an episode on this at one point, Jeff, because this is fascinating. Back when I was teaching art and architecture each year, we talked a lot about how Greeks built cities. In fact, there's a famous monograph, How the Greeks Built Cities, introducing the grid structure.
Yeah.
If you wanted to go from point A to point B, you didn't have to wander circuitously through the highways and byways. You could go at right angles to your destination.
Right. Exactly.
So when you leave College Street, and you want to go to Alpine or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you take a detour south along 131 and then get on the M6 and going to sound like the Californians in a minute and go out to 96 and then backtrack to get to Alpine?
Well, I personally might do that.
You might?
Yes. So,
just for fun?
yes, if my wife was doing the trip, my wife likes, let's just get me from point A to point B in the most direct way, right?
Yeah.
And so she would follow, just the, go here, turn left, turn right.
You're there.
You're there.
That's right.
I'm more of just like, let's go where the roads take us.
You're more like the Denny's kids menu maze approach.
Exactly.
Enter here by the pancakes,
Yeah, right.
past the stack of bacon,
Right.
and eventually get to the Tutti Frutti.
Exactly.
Like
Or
that.
in another establishment, help Ronald find his fries.
That's right.
Eventually.
But the Greeks said, no, that's absurd.
Yes.
Let's put all of our roads at right angles, and you can arrive at your destination more quickly.
Exactly. Cities
With one-way streets, and then the one-way street leads into another one-way street, and then all of a sudden there's a sign, oncoming traffic. Have you been in that kind of spot?
Yes.
Where
Yeah.
suddenly they decide, apparently arbitrarily, that the road is no longer one way.
Yes.
And now you're facing oncoming traffic. There's that moment of panic. Which lane am I supposed to be in?
It's true. I actually, my house is on one of those roads.
That's what I thought.
Yes, it's one way where I live, but if you go, half a mile in the other direction, it's two ways.
Yes.
It's very confusing.
This is not how the Greeks built cities. They imposed a grid structure on everything. However, the point Marrou is making,
Let's get back to that.
is that the city receded
Yes.
from political and educational significance, and it moved more into an individualistic approach.
Yes.
And so that's a theme, Jeff, that Marrou develops more on the next page,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Can you take us into that?
Sure. So on page 98, he writes, the real heir of the ancient city was not, as is often said, with a slight suggestion of contempt, the individual, but the human person who, liberated from the corporate conditioning and totalitarian pressure of city life, now becomes conscious of himself, of his capacities and needs and rights. Henceforth, the norm and justification of all existence are to be found in man. Man considered as an autonomous personality in his own right, achieving the realization of his being beyond the self, perhaps, but certainly through the self, and without ever renouncing his own individuality.
So how is that not individualistic? I couldn't quite understand what Marrou was saying there.
I mean, maybe just he's talking
It's
about
not the individual, but the human person? What's that distinction?
a more kind of expansive notion of the self.
Okay.
I guess is what he's getting. I don't quite get the point he's making at the beginning of that paragraph. But I mean, the larger point is that we do have this move away from, I guess, being a citizen of the world, the citizen of the polis, to the one's self-identity wrapped up.
Okay.
As I think Marrou goes on to say, wrapped up in your vocation.
Right. Maybe this elucidates it a little bit. He says, to a greater extent than any who went before him, Greek man had regarded himself as the center and, quote, measure of all things. That's the Protagoras.
Yeah.
Mhm. And in Hellenistic times, this humanism became conscious of its personalist claims. So I guess it's not just aiming toward the ideal of what an individual is, but realizing that the attainment of that ideal has personal ramifications.
Okay.
I am such a person,
Right.
Rather than we all need to be like Achilles. I'm going to try to be like Achilles, whatever that means.
Yes.
But this is unique to my setting, something like that.
Something like that.
specific.
I guess so. And I wonder how to what degree, the persona, but I mean, both the reality, but also kind of the mythic qualities of someone like Alexander changed this.
Right.
Whereas, before maybe a study of Homer, be heroic,
Right.
pursue arete like Achilles. Now we have this man who did all of these things in real time and in
Right.
recent history.
Right.
And what if that kind of changes, kind of takes it out of the mythic, takes it out of the general and say, look, this person did this.
Right.
And so there's more kind of a gravitation towards that kind of that individual
Yeah.
type of heroism
Right.
or kind of greatness.
Right. I don't know, but I'd like to hear repeat something that I've said from Plutarch many times.
Yeah.
What did Alexander sleep with beneath his pillow?
Oh, yeah.
I know Jeff has you got an old Sony Walkman, don't you?
I do.
Or the Discman?
Discman, yes.
Did you have the Discman at some point?
I glommed onto all those stupid things.
One after the next.
Before it all went digital.
Yes.
I had every one.
But the Walkman with the cassette tape.
Yes.
That was a sleek, agile machine.
It was.
And it ran a long time on few batteries.
It did. Yeah. And I don't know why I keep it underneath my pillow, but
you do.
There it sits.
Is that all that's there, or is there like a half-eaten Snickers bar or something like that?
There's a bag of bugles.
Okay.
Right.
But not Alexander.
No.
Underneath his pillow was a dagger.
Yes.
So he could knife any potential assassins and a copy of the Iliad.
Right.
And that's the ideal. You've got to be a literary man, a speaker of words, and you have to be a doer of deeds. And sometimes that means, doing someone in if necessary.
Yeah. A scholar warrior.
Exactly.
But which is also very interesting that in terms of education, that I guess the warrior part
disappears.
It disappears?
Yes. Yeah. Maybe an interesting analog, and I don't want to get political, but the middle of 19th century the United States, you had Southern gentlemen and Northern gentlemen deeply reading the classics, just deeply enmeshed in the classics, and then going off to West Point.
Right.
And becoming officers and self-consciously seeking to emulate men like Julius Caesar.
Yes.
Right? I'm gonna ride erect on horseback and strike a nice profile against the sun as it rises on the horizon, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm also going to be reading a copy of Cicero's letters or something as I'm moving through the Union or the Confederate camp.
Yeah.
That's what they did, and I guess there's some romanticism to that. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. It makes me think of there's stuff that just kind of pops up in my web browsing is Marcus Aurelius.
Right.
He's
all over now.
He's all over the place, right? But I mean, as a Stoic, right?
Yes.
As a philosopher, but the aspect of Marcus Aurelius as a conquering Roman emperor is kind of
a butcher almost.
Oh yes, kind of is never talked about.
Right.
But I guess Marcus Aurelius would also be in some ways an example of
definitely
the philosopher warrior.
He is the philosopher king.
Right.
Yeah, I should be careful about saying butcher, but I guess it's hard for me to emulate men of war.
Yeah.
Leaving aside, or admire, I should say. It's hard for me to admire. I definitely don't emulate. But
yes.
Leaving aside questions of, was it just war, was it unjust war, there's still something very brutal about Roman activity throughout all of Europe.
Completely agree.
Well, that's a dim note.
All right, Dave. So we're up against it a bit in terms of time. So
right.
let's get to the end of this chapter, where Marrou has another fascinating section, which he titles "The Religion of Culture."
The religion of culture.
Right.
Okay.
And he writes, so this is why we also find amongst the epitaphs on so many funeral monuments, bas reliefs, and statues references to the intellectual attainments of the deceased. Either by their own express wish or on the initiative of their families, they are represented as having been men of letters, orators, philosophers, amateur artists, or lady musicians. So this idea of as things become more individualized and how human beings are now identifying themselves, their intellectual accomplishment becomes kind of the what you lead with in terms of telling the world of who you are or who you were.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. So there's almost nothing now in the American marketplace which is not commoditized.
Yeah.
Right. Everything is a commodity. I know there's a strong reaction the other way in handcrafted and artisanal bakeries and artisanal coffee brewing and so forth.
Right.
That's a reaction to the commoditization. Probably my least favorite is, have you seen this? Handcrafted banking solutions.
I haven't seen that.
Have you not seen that? Billboards all over Grand Rapids.
Oh, really?
Yes. Open an artisanal banking account. And I think this is the most absurd kind of marketing.
So you open a checking account, you get a cheese platter with it?
I don't know. But clearly, they're trying to take something that is strictly a commodity.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know how you choose a bank, but I choose it by convenience and what are the rates. I'm just very pragmatic about that.
Completely.
I don't want a relationship with, but it's all about trying to give the appearance of something not commoditized.
Yes. Yeah. Completely true. Yeah.
So as there's more commoditization, is it possible that something like what Marrou describes could emerge? If we're all wearing the same clothes, driving the same cars, eating the same foods,
yeah.
Is it possible that things that previously were not valued very much might become more valuable because they become marks of distinction and separation from others?
I think so. I mean, I think there's always that element in human culture of kind of pushing back.
Right.
I guess if something becomes too mainstream.
Right.
It kind of reminds me, I mean, this is a stupid example of, I'll have kids in my class, they show up with the t-shirts advertising Nirvana.
Right.
Or,
I've seen that.
Bands from the 90s.
30 years ago.
Or, less so, but you also see like, the Beatles and
Right.
such. And, or even kind of the impulse of lots of people to collect vinyl.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
And so there's always there's kind of that old school, if everything becomes too mainstream, well, let's go to something that nobody's doing.
Right.
Until that becomes mainstream.
Then there has to be a reaction to that.
Yeah. Right.
But Jeff, does Marrou say that these monuments, these epitaphs and bas relief sculptures, were they limited to an intellectual elite?
No, he goes on here. So he writes, these monuments were not, as it was once believed, necessarily raised to professional intellectuals such as teachers, artists, or writers. We know that in most cases, they were dedicated to private individuals whose professional activity took them into quite other fields, medicine or the army or business. But all, no matter what their profession, wanted one thing to be recorded on their tombs, the fact that they had won the friendship of the muses, had possessed the one incomparable treasure, a cultured mind.
Interesting. That's appealing, isn't it?
It is. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So what's going to be on the Winkle tombstone?
Well, I've always, when asked this question, which has happened very rarely, said, I want to be cremated and
What?
Yeah, put me on a shelf somewhere.
No.
Yeah.
I don't want that.
You don't want that? What do you
No.
What do you want?
I don't want that for you.
I'm dead. Who cares?
I care. Think about the living, my man.
Yeah.
I think you should put on the tombstone something like played the guitar, self-taught pianist, father, athlete, all that, and then something about check out his SoundCloud.
Really?
Yes.
Which will probably be defunct within a couple of years of my.
Well, okay. When I say check out his SoundCloud, I don't mean you have to go to a specific music app, but check out his oeuvre of the kind of music he made, right? Because you put a lot of heart and soul into that, don't you? The creation of original music and cover songs.
I do.
You enjoy that.
I do enjoy it very much.
That's the cultured mind. You have won the friendship of the muses, have you not?
I guess so. So I guess maybe if I was following this ancient path, maybe I would do something like that.
Okay,
right?
so let me ask you a series of questions.
All right.
You like music, yes?
I do.
Do you want to win the friendship of the muses?
In as much as that means I want to be good at what I do in the musical realm, yes.
Okay, but does it also include not just being good at what you do, but having others recognize your musical goodness?
That's an added bonus, but it's not. I don't need that.
So you don't care about public opinion of your artistry?
Not really.
So I don't know if you're more Hellenistic or less for that reason. I think you're probably more Hellenistic. If you were more a 5th century Athenian, you wouldn't have a sense of identity and excellence without the recognition of your peers.
I need to think about this more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
so
the goal here is-
I'm going to throw it back on you. What would
The goal here is to sell you a tombstone
Is this kind of side hustle you got going on?
with something engraved on it about how you won the friendship of the muses.
I like that phrase. Maybe. Yeah.
You boil down all the things that you do day after day, year after year.
Mm-hmm.
I know your family and your faith; those are really important to you. And without those things, life is unlivable or extremely different.
Yeah.
But there are other things that you like to do as well.
I'm thinking that just on my tombstone of having this quote. He won the friendship of the muses, and leaving it to the visitor to the stone
To figure out-
to contemplate what that means
And how he did it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Now, what about you?
Well, in terms of leaving it to the visitor to figure things out,
Yes.
there's going to be Greek and Latin on my tombstone.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know about Hebrew, but Greek and Latin for sure. That's my desire.
And what are you going to write in those languages?
That I haven't decided.
Okay.
Maybe a couple little lines from Homer or Ovid.
Yeah.
Maybe a New Testament quote. Why do you seek the living among the dead? I've often thought about that one.
Yeah.
I like the ancient Greek tombstones that you can see, in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, which ask a kind of provocative or flippant question of the viewer. Kind of like, hey, dummy, what are you doing here?
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to be that abrasive.
Right.
But I think there should be something that, just kind of pokes the viewer a little bit to get them to consider why you're here and what you're doing.
Yes, exactly. No, that's good. I mean, I love the quote, the idea of why do you seek the living amongst the dead?
Right.
So as someone who I love to visit cemeteries, and I love the artistry of tombs, and I find it very interesting what people choose to kind of leave behind.
Yes, I do too.
I want more tombstones asking me, why exactly are you here?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and as I know you like to visit the tombstones of the famous and so forth.
Yes.
In the previous episode, you talked about going down to Battle Creek and seeing the tomb of Walker Johnson. What was his name?
Junior Walker.
Junior Walker.
Right.
A saxophone player.
Right. And there's an engraving of a saxophone on his tomb.
Of course.
Right?
Now, why is that there?
Right, because he won the friendship of the muses.
He won the friendship of the muses.
Yeah.
But do you have to be famous? You know that on Elvis's tombstone, there's some kind of musical illusion, right?
Yes, and have you been to Elvis's?
I haven't.
It's very tacky.
Is it?
As you would expect.
Does it say he wasn't nothing but a hound dog?
It's I don't think there's on the tombstone itself. There's no reference to his music, but it's in a garden next to Graceland.
Yeah.
So it's in the midst of all of this.
Yeah.
These tacky memorials of kind of the excesses of who this man was.
Right.
Yeah. So.
You probably won't like this, but John Calvin insisted on an unmarked tomb.
Oh, did he really?
Yes.
Hey, do we know where it is?
No, because it's unmarked.
I know, but
it was just in
sometimes
it was just in the pauper cemetery.
Really?
He insisted that they just take him out and dump him off and cover it up, and then it's forgotten. So
that's so interesting.
I mean, the general area is known,
right? But we don't. There's no memorial to him.
No, there's lots of bodies there.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
Well, we have to wrap up this chapter, so I think we should focus here on just the last two paragraphs, because there's a lot of interesting material here about immortality. So if I could just read, this is page 101. Mm-hmm. This curious doctrine of immortality as a thing merited by culture is very old. It appears very clearly in the death of Pythagoras, to whom Metapontus and Croton paid the divine honors which until then had been reserved for heroes who had founded or saved cities. So if you founded a city or you saved a city, you were apotheosized. How do I say that? Apotheosized.
There you go. There you go.
Wow. It's early in the morning. Apotheosized, turned into a god. But Pythagoras was not a city founder or a savior, and he was apotheosized into a divinity. In the classical epic, apotheosis by way of culture remained the privilege of exceptional persons, great scholars, founders of sects, as we have seen after Pythagoras, Plato received this honor. But in Hellenistic and Roman times, the practice spread widely. Apotheosization came to be regarded indeed as something quite commonplace. And from that time onward, it was only natural that every poet, every thinker, every artist, every man of letters, every disciple of the Muses, parentheses, Jeff Winkle, should aspire to it. They could all claim the splendid title of musikos aner, a man of the Muses, i.e., a man sanctified and saved by those goddesses.
So there's a universalization of this idea as the world becomes, not the Attic Peninsula, but becomes this broad swath of Hellenistic culture.
Not the polis, right? Not I'm an Athenian and I have to outshine the Corinthians and the Spartans and the Thebans, but I'm a person who has a direct connection to the Muses.
Yeah.
So is it kind of a commoditization of culture almost?
Yeah.
It comes down to every individual?
Yeah, exactly.
Jeff, could you just read maybe the last sentence in this fascinating chapter?
Sure. This kind of mysticism was not, of course, professed by all the men of letters with the same consciousness and the same intrepid faith, but to some degree, it affected the culture of them all. Paideia, a thing divine, a heavenly game, a nobility of soul, was invested with a kind of sacred radiance that gave it a special dignity of a genuinely religious kind. In the deep confusion caused by the sudden collapse of ancient beliefs, it was the one true, unshakable value to which the mind of man could cling. And Hellenistic culture, thus erected into an absolute, eventually became for many the equivalent of a religion. So it becomes kind of a religion that's accepted by all.
Yes, right. Center of identity.
A center of identity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fascinating.
That's really interesting. Well, we are up against it, so we got to get out of here, do we not?
We do.
Why exactly? Some banging going on the doors out there?
There's always somebody's always trying to get in here. Do you have any idea who this is this time?
I think it is a man by the name of Diligent Steve.
Diligent Steve?
Diligent Steve. You don't remember?
I don't remember. I remember Lazy Steve.
Way back, episode 16, maybe it was episode 18.
Yeah.
Cranks for the Memories.
Yes.
That was one that you titled, about William Perkins and Alexander Dixon and Giordano Bruno and Peter Ramus, about how to build memory castles and so on and so forth. And we were blathering on, as is our wont. And you said something like you mean like a lazy Susan?
Yes.
And I said, Jeff, that's so chauvinistic.
Right.
Why does it have to be Susan who is the lazy one? And you said, okay, it's a lazy Steve.
The Lazy Steve. Right.
And we have, since that time, worked so hard to turn that into a running gag.
Right, exactly. I mean, Lazy Steve, he's shown up a few times.
He has.
Yes, exactly.
But now it's Diligent
Steve
at the door seeking some recompense.
I gotcha.
He's got a vendetta. So we better sneak out the back door.
All right.
Before things get a little nasty.
Let's do that. So before we sneak out that door, Dave, what if some of our listeners want to learn Greek or want to learn Latin? What do you have to offer them?
Oh, well, I'm so glad you asked.
Yes.
If they want to read Greek, they should go to mossmethod.com. I have this program which will take you from...
neophyte to erudite.
Very nice. I thought you were going to miss it.
Oh, man.
Got your cue. If you know little or no Greek, I can take you from that point, God willing, to a place of tremendous Greek knowledge. I've developed this program. Each module has 40 lessons. You learn to read the language from day one. It's not like most textbooks. Memorize a rule, apply a rule in one sentence, forget the rule, memorize the next rule.
Yeah.
No, you're reading real stories from the very first day. Stories adapted from classical authors like Lucian and Aesop and Herodotus and Plato. So there's just a lot of great stuff there. The course is self-paced, so you work at your own rate. You have 1 year to complete the module. It's expert. I take the last 30 years of my own study, 30 plus years of studying and teaching Greek, and compress it into this course. Self-paced, expert, and accessible. You have access to me each week in our office hours, where you can study with other students from around the world. As I like to say, there may be a better program. I don't know about that, but I am sure there is not a better value. That is combination of expertise and price.
Excellent. And so if people go to mossmethod.com, they can check out some of your free stuff.
Absolutely.
Before they dive in head first. And
yes.
Yeah, very, very cool. Now, what about Latin?
Yeah, so Latin, we just this past week, launched Unit 2 of our Lingua Latina per se Illustrata, the Hans Orberg textbook, Latin Teaches Itself. I like to translate it that way. So Unit 1 is chapters 1 through 9. Unit 2 is chapters 10 through 18, and we have a beta. If you want to get in on the ground floor, we are releasing a lesson 1 per week. You can get in on the beta for extremely cheap, $175, which will eventually include all 40 plus lessons.
Great.
And we're going to run a special where you can get Units 1 and Units 2 together at a lower rate before we do a little price increase. So if you've been on the fence and you think, I want to get in on this, now's the time. So go to latinperdiem.com/LLPSI or /shop, and you're going to find some great things there.
Excellent. And you're learning along with other students and
yes,
benefiting from their successes and their mistakes.
That's right. Yeah. Men, women, old, young, retirees, grad students, pastors, young kids, 12, 13, 14.
Fantastic.
You can learn really at any age.
That's great.
So if you don't want to learn Greek and Latin, okay, I can learn to live with that. But if you say that you can't or there's not an opportunity, I can't live with that.
Yes.
That's just not true.
Right.
Jeff, we got some people to thank.
Yes. As always, Mishka, our wonderful engineer, who makes us sound better than we are. Scott Vincent, Ken Tamplin, those two amazing musicians, just ripping it up. And they're the guys behind the great stuff you hear throughout the episode.
So generous.
To allow us to use their music, and so inspirational for guitar players like me. And hey, if you want to have a shout out, if you got a question, a suggestion, a complaint, you can always get in touch with us. You can write to Dave at adnauseam.com. Don't forget that V.
Or Jeff at adnauseam.com. Don't forget there is a V in there. ADNAVSEAM. We'd love to hear from you. We will get back to you.
Yes. And in the meantime, show your love for the podcast by going to adnauseam.com. Again, that V. And check out our Lurch with Merch section. Pick yourself up a t-shirt. It's always in style.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Jeff, I believe you have today's gustatory parting shot.
I do. And we were just talking about Pythagoras.
Yes, we were.
This is a quote attributed to him. He writes, "Salt is born of the purest of parents, the sun and the sea."
There you go. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.